As I alluded to earlier in my presentation, I like to argue that we really now in the 21st century are living in a global century. To me, there's no country or no region that will dominate the world. I think we are beginning to see from the global financial crisis that there is a need for greater global interaction, for global action to be taken. And I think in this regard, reforms of in the international financial system, international financial architecture needs to be tackled from a global perspective and not just from the perspective of any individual country. So in this regard, I think let's think globally as global citizens and let's engage all the key players in the world. I mean, the US is a very important player, will remain an important player. China, India, Japan are all important players. Europe is critically important. So let's think globally and engage the whole world.
Thanks. Further question over this way? And please, microphone coming through.
Thank you very much. Talal Yassin, Managing Director of Crescent Wealth. Mine's a more relatively specific question, and that is, I've always believed, as Paul Keating said, security in Asia, security from Asia. The point was made by our distinguished panellists that Australia is part of Asia in an economic sense, notwithstanding any other measure of history and the tyranny of distance arguments from our traditional Western culture, so to speak. I'm one that has been believing that it's also economic security in Asia rather than from Asia or adjacent to Asia. Just north of Australia, in India, in China, certainly in Indonesia and in Malaysia, a very significant proportion of the world's Muslims live, notwithstanding the fact that we hear a lot about the Middle East. Australia has always been a supporter, theoretically and in principle, and in a policy sense, about developing a niche finance segment in the Australian market as a gateway, given the great economic story we have here. What do the panellists think about Australia as that gateway and as somewhere where I guess Australia could play a much bigger role, since we're very embryonic, to say the least?
Thank you. Someone who hasn't made a contribution. Manju, would you like to make an observation? And I say this because one of the references in the question was to Islamic populations in Asia, and India is, if not the largest, close to the largest Islamic population in the world.
I'll take it to it.
Much closer.
There is an engagement which is very necessary with Australia, with the Asian countries as such. And like as Steve mentioned, that the growing population, India, if you take it separately, but if you take Asia as a whole, that is also increasing, with particularly the middle class rising everywhere. And the opportunities are across the board for Australia when you look at it, whether it be in the realm of infrastructure, where you have a say and where you have the technologies, whether you look at the sector of food and food processing, or the sector of retail, which is all coming up in a big way, logistics, which is also in high demand, warehousing. You name the sector and you have the capability of technology transfers. The other is, of course, the mining sector, where you are way, way ahead. But the others is also a win-win situation in the mining and resources by tapping onto the ICT sector, particularly in the Philippines and India, where we are a little ahead in the services and where we can have a competitive advantage as a win-win situation if we match your capabilities with our IT sector. So if you look at the realm of sectors and across sectors, I think Australia will and should play a larger role in the Asian century.
Thank you, Manju. I'm going to ask Murray Green, then Jonathan Mills, both to make brief summary remarks from your perspective. Murray, Burma, Myanmar's emergence, remarkable. You were there, new rules changing. Final observation from you.
Well, I think Australia's got a particular opportunity to be not the only curator of the regional experience, but particularly in terms of the discussion we've been having about seeing the wider Asia-Pacific. I think we do have a role as a curator of that Pacific experience in terms of engaging with the wider Asian community, and it's something I'd like to explore and think about.
Thank you. Jonathan, from your global
Yes,
perspective.
I was very struck by what the ambassador had to say, and I think it's a very powerful thing for us to contemplate in Australia. It also resonates with what Dr. Ken Henry was saying, that we can have it both ways, but actually that it's not about having it both ways, that we actually must develop a complex set of relationships and a complex set of understandings of ourselves. From an Asian perspective, we've had a very clear statement which says that Australia to Asia represents Western civilization in the midst of Asia. And I think that we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge that potency, and we need to not walk away from it. And that will have profound impact in the nature, the shape of our person-to-person relationships, but also in the way in which we frame our institutions. We should not, for example, try to pretend we are other than we are. We should play to our strengths, and we should make sure that in creating new institutions, but in re-energizing existing institutions, we bear that very important fact in mind. And I would say this, of course, as a cultural leader from Australia but living in Europe, that I've been amazed at the eye-watering statistics that have come out of this panel, and they are extraordinarily powerful tools for Australian cultural sector, for Australian creativity, for Australian artists, and for Australian institutions of higher education, to not just take advantage of, because that sounds rather too pessimistic and rather too narrow-minded, but actually to acknowledge that we have an expanding role, and that, again, I would say that it is incredible that the goodwill that was presented around the Colombo plan. And so it's not about money. We're spending a lot more money and we're getting a lot less kudos for a lot better actual reaction today. But the difference is that we're talking about it in the wrong language. I think the language, the symbolism, and the institutional entrepreneurship in all of this debate is essential to underpin our goodwill and underpin that we actually are going to enter this Asian century as people who are very clearly representative of Western civilization, but very clearly understanding and sensitive to the great cultures and the great traditions of Asia itself.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a beautiful way to bring the panel almost to a close. Maria, I'm going to throw to you in a moment to thank the panel. But just as one personal observation that Dato Michael Yeoh made in his comments, he mentioned that he was a student at Monash University some years ago. And of course, it highlights just what you were saying, Jonathan, and others, that this exists already between us. And the lovely symmetry there is the Vice-Chancellor of Monash University, Professor Ed Byrne, is with us this morning and will be speaking to us later. And he's asked me to let you know that Monash has joined the long list of sponsors of our ongoing Global Foundation program. So welcome to Monash. Maria, to thank our panel.
Thank you, Steve. It's a contribution today is really the formative days of a debate. Australia in an Asian century. I've seen Ken Henry write. I hope you're doing shorthand there, Ken. So it is the beginning of a debate. What a clever and dynamic and diverse opinion we've heard from the panel. So on behalf of the Global Foundation, please join me in thanking our guests this morning.